Good evening, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about a subject that's both psychologically complex and increasingly relevant: narcissism. Specifically, what causes a narcissist to break psychologically and emotionally. Now, let's be clear, when we use the term narcissist, we're not just talking about someone who's vain or self-absorbed. We're referring to individuals with entrenched patterns, what's clinically termed narcissistic personality disorder, or in many cases, strong narcissistic traits. These individuals build an identity around admiration, control, and validation, and while they often appear unshakable on the outside, there are precise psychological triggers, 4 of them, that they rarely, if ever, recover from. We're going to break these down using evidence from clinical psychology and neuroscience. Narcissistic supply is the lifeblood of a narcissist's psychological system. It is not a luxury. They do not just enjoy praise or attention. It is essential to their emotional survival. Just as a healthy person requires food, sleep, and social connection to maintain balance, the narcissist needs consistent, predictable doses of admiration, validation, or even fear and control to stabilize their identity. Without it, their sense of self begins to unravel. At the neurological level, this need is deeply tied to the brain's reward circuitry. Narcissists typically have heightened sensitivity in the dopaminergic system, particularly in the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens, which are responsible for reward anticipation and receipt. When they receive praise, likes on social media, or expressions of envy from others, their brain lights up with activity similar to a drug high. It's not just pleasant, it's necessary. Over time, just like with addictive substances, they build a tolerance. The same compliment that once fed their ego no longer has the same effect, and they need more validation, more followers, more admiration to get the same emotional high. Now, when that supply is cut off, when people stop reacting, when a partner detaches, when an audience leaves, the narcissist enters a state of psychological withdrawal. It's not merely disappointment, it's disorientation. Their brain is no longer receiving the stimulation it depends on to reinforce their inflated sense of self. This is when you start seeing extreme emotional responses: rage, panic, obsessive attempts to re-engage, or even depression masked by blame. What you're witnessing is the ego's collapse. Psychologically, narcissists do not possess a stable core identity. Instead, they operate from what is often called a false self, a constructed image they present to the world to gain approval and dominance. This false self is propped up by narcissistic supply. Remove that supply, and they are confronted with an inner void, a sense of worthlessness and insignificance they've spent their whole lives trying to suppress. This is where the internal tension becomes unbearable. Unlike emotionally resilient individuals who can recalibrate and find grounding within themselves, narcissists lack the internal architecture to self-regulate. They depend entirely on the external world to tell them who they are. When that world goes silent, they feel like they're disappearing. This is why strategies like the gray rock method or emotional detachment are so effective in protecting oneself from narcissistic abuse. These approaches don't offer the narcissist any energy to feed on. No anger, no explanation, no emotional reaction. To a narcissist, this is more painful than confrontation. Anger gives them power, silence gives them none. It leaves them with the worst-case scenario: emotional invisibility. Some may try to re-establish the supply by love, bombing guilt, tripping, or manipulating through crisis narratives. If those fail, they may escalate to smear campaigns, portraying themselves as the victim in an attempt to win back attention. Even if it's negative, that's important to understand. Narcissistic supply doesn't always come in the form of praise. Hatred, fear, and chaos can also feed their system, as long as they remain the central focus. The goal is not peace, it's relevance. Over time, if the loss of supply becomes permanent, if key sources like romantic partners, social media audiences, or professional accolades are gone for good, the narcissist begins to deteriorate. Some become reclusive, entering states of depression and paranoia. Others frantically seek new sources, often cycling through people or roles without stability, and some double down on delusion, creating grandiose fantasies or adopting extreme personas to attract attention again. But deep beneath these behaviors is a nervous system in chaos, trying to make sense of a reality where they no longer matter. This internal collapse is not always visible on the outside. Many narcissists are highly skilled at presenting a calm, even charismatic exterior, especially when they feel their image is threatened. But inside, their brain and body are reacting as if in crisis. Cortisol levels rise, sleep becomes disturbed, and the prefrontal cortex, responsible for reason and long-term planning, may become compromised. This leads to poor decision making, risk-taking, and interpersonal sabotage. All of it is driven by one thing: the desperate need to restore narcissistic supply. The tragedy here is that the narcissist often doesn't understand the root of their pain. They may blame others, accuse people of betrayal, or insist the world is against them, but what they're truly experiencing is an identity in freefall. They're addicted to validation, but incapable of generating true self-worth. They crave connection but sabotage intimacy. They demand control, yet lose themselves in the process. For those on the outside, partners, friends, colleagues, it's crucial to recognize that you are not the cause of their suffering, even if they try to convince you otherwise. You are merely the mirror they use to see themselves, and when you take that mirror away, they are left with a reflection they cannot bear. This is what breaks them: not criticism, not rejection, but the absence of fuel. The loss of attention, the silence that forces them to face who they are, without the applause, and for many narcissists, that's the one thing they can never recover from. Exposure and public shame strike at the very heart of a narcissist's psychological construction. For most people, being called out or criticized may sting, but with emotional maturity and a stable sense of self, they can process, reflect, and recover. Narcissists, however, operate from a fundamentally different framework. Their identity is not rooted in authenticity or self-awareness, but in an elaborate false self, a persona crafted meticulously to project superiority, competence, and perfection. This false self is their armor, and public exposure is the equivalent of a direct hit to the center of that armor. It doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes them entirely. At a neurological level, this experience activates what we call a high-threat response. When exposed or shamed publicly, the narcissist's amygdala, responsible for detecting danger, fires up intensely. This isn't just psychological discomfort, it's a full-blown survival response. Their brain reads exposure as a threat to existence because their sense of self is so fragile and externally dependent. The sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive, increased heart rate, shallow breathing, cortisol flooding the system. It's the same physiological reaction someone might have in a life-threatening situation. To the narcissist, being publicly revealed as flawed or dishonest feels like ego death. This reaction isn't simply because they were caught. It's because exposure disrupts the illusion they have so carefully constructed. Narcissists spend enormous energy maintaining a certain image, whether as the ideal partner, the irreplaceable boss, the brilliant artist, or the selfless friend. When that image is contradicted, especially in front of others, their entire internal structure begins to crumble. Unlike emotionally healthy individuals who can acknowledge mistakes or flaws as part of being human, narcissists interpret any sign of weakness as annihilation. Their identity doesn't allow for error because error equals unworthiness. Public shame compounds the damage. It's not just the revelation of the truth, it's the audience that witnesses it. Narcissists are hyper-attuned to social evaluation. Their self-esteem is not self-generated, it's outsourced to the perceptions of others. So when others see their mask slip, the narcissist feels psychologically naked. The shame they experience is not the productive kind that can lead to growth. It is toxic, all-consuming, and deeply tied to humiliation. In their internal narrative, they've gone from being admired to being ridiculed, and that transition is intolerable. The reactions to this kind of exposure can vary, but they usually follow predictable paths. One common response is narcissistic rage. This isn't simple anger, it's an explosive, disproportionate reaction designed to intimidate, discredit, or destroy the source of the exposure. The goal is not resolution, it's retaliation. The narcissist feels wounded and humiliated, so they strike back with verbal abuse, threats, or attempts to smear the person who exposed them. From a neurobiological standpoint, this rage is a defense mechanism. It's the brain's way of reasserting control when it feels helpless. Another response is denial and deflection. Some narcissists will flat out reject reality, even when presented with undeniable evidence. They may twist the narrative, accuse others of lying, or claim victimhood. This is not simply lying, it's a form of cognitive self-preservation. If the truth invalidates their self-image, they must reject the truth to survive emotionally. Their brain is trying to preserve a coherent identity, even if it requires fabricating one. In more covert narcissists, exposure might lead to a collapse rather than an explosion. These individuals may retreat, isolate, or spiral into depression, not because they are genuinely remorseful, but because the public humiliation has triggered a sense of inner worthlessness they have no tools to cope with. In these cases, the exposure strips away their grandiosity and leaves behind a raw, unintegrated shame that they cannot process or resolve. It's a fall from imagined grace into an emotional abyss. What makes public shame so damaging is also its permanence in today's world. Social media, digital records, and viral content mean that once something is exposed, it often lives online forever. For the narcissist, this creates a constant threat of re-experiencing the humiliation. Their carefully managed image is now unstable, and no matter how many new masks they try to wear, the shadow of their exposure follows them. This lingering sense of vulnerability is intolerable. It's not uncommon for narcissists in this situation to change environments, cut off relationships, or even reinvent their identities entirely in an attempt to escape the shame. Ultimately, exposure is not merely a disruption, it's a collapse of control. Narcissists survive by controlling perception, how others see them, how stories are told, and how emotions are managed. Public shame strips them of that control. They are seen in a way they didn't authorize, through a lens they didn't design. For a narcissist, that loss of narrative power is catastrophic. And yet, ironically, exposure is often what leads others to finally see through the charm, manipulation, and deception. It's the point at which the narcissist can no longer control the room. And for those who have suffered under their influence, it can be the first breath of fresh air, the moment when the truth finally speaks louder than the performance. But for the narcissist, that same moment is a psychological free fall. They are no longer the admired, the envied, or the in control. They are simply human, flawed, exposed, and vulnerable, and to them, that is the one thing they were never willing to be. Rejection by someone the narcissist deems inferior creates a unique kind of psychological injury, one that cuts deeper than simple dismissal or criticism. Narcissists operate through a lens of hierarchical thinking. They view relationships not as spaces for mutual growth or connection, but as platforms for status, control, and validation. Everyone in their life is unconsciously ranked. Some are seen as competitors, others as tools, and many as being beneath them, emotionally, intellectually, socially, or morally. These inferior individuals are not necessarily less capable, but the narcissist chooses to see them that way in order to maintain a sense of superiority. When one of these individuals rejects the narcissist, it causes a cognitive and emotional rupture that they are fundamentally unequipped to handle. To understand why, we need to consider the architecture of a narcissist's identity. Their sense of self is not built on self-awareness or internal validation. It is fragile, externally defined, and inflated through constant reinforcement from others. They build their self-worth by dominating or devaluing others. When someone they've categorized as inferior suddenly asserts independence, says no, walks away, or expresses disinterest, the narcissist is thrown into an emotional paradox. They can't comprehend how someone lesser could reject someone as superior as them. This challenges not just their ego, it challenges the very logic of their internal world. Neurologically, this situation creates a high conflict response in the brain. The rejection activates the anterior cingulate cortex, which processes social pain, and the insula, which registers disgust and emotional conflict. These are the same regions that light up in moments of betrayal or physical distress. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex, which handles rational decision-making and emotional regulation, becomes compromised. The narcissist doesn't simply feel hurt. They feel violated by a reality that doesn't match their self-constructed belief system. This creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when two conflicting beliefs cannot coexist. On one hand, they see themselves as superior and in control. On the other, they've been dismissed or devalued by someone they had deemed beneath them. This rejection forces a confrontation with something narcissists work very hard to avoid: their own vulnerability. It undermines their illusion of omnipotence and exposes the emptiness behind their grandiosity. In many cases, their immediate reaction is to devalue the person even further. They may launch into insult, ridicule, or contempt, anything to reassert the original hierarchy. But this response is defensive, not grounded in confidence. It's an attempt to erase the emotional wound by rewriting the story in real time. They didn't reject me, I rejected them. It becomes the internal narrative. The rejection didn't happen because they weren't enough. It happened because the other person was flawed, ungrateful, unstable, or delusional. These distortions help them avoid the deep feelings of inadequacy they're desperate to suppress. Sometimes the rejection leads not to anger but to obsession. The narcissist may become fixated on the individual who rejected them. This isn't love, it's an egoic fixation. They may bombard the person with messages, try to win them back through manipulation, or stalk them on social media. The goal is not reconciliation or connection, it's restoration of control. They need that person to re-enter the dynamic in a submissive role so the narcissist can reassert dominance and repair the wound to their self-image. If the person resists, the narcissist may oscillate between idealizing them and vilifying them, a pattern commonly known as splitting. This black and white thinking is another mechanism for managing the internal chaos caused by rejection. The long-term psychological impact of being rejected by someone they deem inferior is often profound. Unlike other wounds, which may fade with time or be replaced with new sources of narcissistic supply, this type of rejection lingers. It becomes a psychological loophole in their narrative of superiority, a loose thread they can't pull without unraveling their entire identity. Some narcissists carry this resentment for years, mentioning the person in conversations, comparing new partners or friends to them, or using them as examples of betrayal. Others may try to erase the experience entirely, pretending it never happened while avoiding any situation that might lead to a similar loss of power. It's also worth noting that narcissists are especially prone to projecting their own shame and fear onto the person who rejected them. They may accuse that person of being narcissistic, ungrateful, or toxic. This is a form of psychological defense called projection. It allows them to avoid introspection by assigning blame externally. Rather than asking, why did this person feel the need to leave, they tell themselves they were broken all along. This protects their ego, but at the cost of any real emotional growth or healing. For the person doing the rejecting, especially if they've been devalued or controlled, this moment can be profoundly empowering, but it often comes with backlash. Narcissists are unlikely to let go quietly. They may attempt to draw the person back in through guilt, flattery, or threats, all in an effort to reclaim their perceived position of dominance. Recognizing this dynamic is crucial for anyone who has been involved with a narcissist. The rejection is not just a personal decision. It is an existential injury to someone who sees themselves as above being refused. Ultimately, rejection by someone deemed inferior disrupts the narcissist's foundational belief system. It tells them in no uncertain terms that their superiority is not universal, that their control is not absolute, and that the people they see as beneath them may, in fact, be the ones who are finally setting themselves free. And for a narcissist, that is not just rejection, it is collapse. Genuine indifference from others is perhaps one of the most psychologically devastating experiences a narcissist can face. While overt criticism or confrontation may trigger rage or manipulation, indifference delivers a far more subtle and corrosive blow. It does not attack the narcissist directly, it simply ignores them, and for someone whose entire sense of identity is constructed around external validation, being ignored is not just uncomfortable, it's a threat to their existence. To understand why indifference is so powerful, we have to recognize how the narcissistic ego functions. Unlike healthy individuals who derive self-worth from internal values, achievements, and meaningful relationships, narcissists rely on what psychologists refer to as narcissistic supply. This supply comes in many forms: admiration, envy, obedience, fear, or even conflict, but the key ingredient is attention. They don't care whether they're loved or hated as long as they remain the focal point of someone else's emotional energy. That energy reinforces their inflated self-image and wards off the inner void they are constantly trying to escape. Indifference removes that energy completely. It doesn't engage, it doesn't react, it doesn't even acknowledge. It communicates in the most silent and unsettling way possible that the narcissist simply does not matter. This cuts deeper than anger or insult because it strips them of relevance. In the narcissist's mind, relevance is identity. If they're not being noticed, admired, or feared, they don't know who they are. On a neurobiological level, this indifference registers as a withdrawal of reward. The brain's reward system, particularly the dopamine pathways, is hypersensitive in individuals with narcissistic traits. When someone shows interest, whether positive or negative, the narcissist's brain lights up with anticipation and gratification. But when faced with a neutral or disinterested response, the expected dopamine surge never arrives. Over time, this creates a pattern of emotional deprivation similar to addiction withdrawal. The narcissist may begin to feel anxious, depressed, or enraged, not because something explicit was said or done, but because the expected validation never came. This is particularly intolerable when the indifference comes from people the narcissist believes they should have influence over. Whether it's a former partner, a colleague, or even a casual acquaintance, if someone shows no interest in their charm, accomplishments, or superiority, it creates an incongruent experience. Their internal narrative, "I am important, special, and captivating," clashes with the reality that someone simply doesn't care. This dissonance is not something they can easily rationalize. In fact, it may drive them to intensify their efforts, becoming more performative, provocative, or manipulative in a desperate attempt to provoke any kind of reaction. They would rather be hated than ignored. When those attempts fail, the narcissist may spiral. Without engagement, they begin to lose psychological grip on their constructed identity. They may obsess over the indifferent person, trying to figure out why they don't care. They may start stalking their social media, fishing for signs that they've changed their mind or are secretly affected. This obsession isn't rooted in genuine affection, it's rooted in the need to restore their sense of power and influence. Indifference renders them powerless, and powerlessness is intolerable. In some cases, the narcissist may respond with contempt or dismissal. They'll convince themselves that the indifferent person is emotionally damaged, envious, or beneath notice. This is a form of projection and deflection, a way of protecting the ego by externalizing the discomfort. If they can label the other person as defective, they don't have to confront the possibility that they are simply not as captivating or important as they believe. But despite these defenses, the wound remains. Unlike dramatic conflicts that flare up and burn out, indifference leaves a lingering psychological void. The narcissist is left alone with themselves, and for many, this is a terrifying experience. Without others reflecting their constructed persona back at them, they are forced to confront the parts of themselves they usually avoid: shame, insecurity, fear of insignificance. These are the emotions they've spent a lifetime suppressing through control, charm, or coercion. And indifference brings them all to the surface. For those on the receiving end of narcissistic behavior, genuine indifference can be one of the most powerful tools for self-protection. It's not about playing games or withholding emotion. It's about stepping out of the narcissist's energy field entirely. It sends the message that your emotional resources are no longer available for exploitation. You're not feeding the drama, not defending yourself, not trying to prove anything. You've simply chosen not to participate, and for the narcissist, that choice is incomprehensible and deeply wounding. In a way, indifference mirrors what the narcissist fears most: emotional irrelevance. They work tirelessly to be the center of attention, to shape narratives, to control perception. When someone refuses to engage, to even notice, it confirms a truth they cannot face: that their influence has limits, that their importance is not universal, and that their constructed identity depends entirely on the reactions of others. This is why narcissists will do almost anything to avoid or reverse indifference. They may suddenly become generous, apologetic, or even vulnerable, whatever it takes to re-engage the emotional connection. But these efforts are often short-lived and transactional. Once they regain attention, they usually revert to the same destructive patterns, because at their core, they're not seeking connection. They are seeking reinforcement. Genuine indifference, when consistent and authentic, doesn't just withhold validation. It dismantles the narcissist's illusion of control, and once that illusion starts to break, it forces a confrontation with the very part of themselves they've been running from all along. Not the grandiose self, not the admired mask, but the quiet, unacknowledged truth that without an audience they don't know who they are. Witnessing the success of someone they once rejected or devalued is one of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences for a narcissist. While rejection is something they often dish out liberally, whether by ending relationships, belittling colleagues, or discarding friends, they rarely anticipate a future where those same people rise above and thrive without them. For the narcissist, this isn't just surprising, it's humiliating. Their entire world is predicated on superiority and control, and when someone they dismissed goes on to succeed, it undermines the very illusion they live by. The narcissistic mind operates on a rigid sense of hierarchy. People are either useful or disposable, superior or inferior. When they reject someone, it's usually done with a sense of finality, under the assumption that the person is lucky to have been associated with them at all. The rejection often comes wrapped in demeaning behavior, passive aggression, or complete indifference. It's designed to convey one message: you are beneath me, and without me, you'll fail. So when the opposite happens, when the person flourishes, finds peace, achieves success, or becomes admired by others, it creates a cognitive and emotional rupture that the narcissist cannot easily reconcile. The narrative they built around their own importance begins to collapse. They are forced, even momentarily, to consider a reality where they are not the central catalyst in someone else's story. This is intolerable for a psyche built on control and inflated self-worth. Neurologically, the narcissist experiences this as a threat response. The brain's limbic system, particularly the amygdala, activates the same circuitry involved in social threat and loss. It's not just envy, it's psychological injury. The sight or knowledge of an ex-partner, former employee, or estranged friend succeeding without them triggers a cascade of emotions: shame, rage, insecurity, and helplessness. The narcissist may mask these feelings with sarcasm or dismissal, but internally, they're grappling with an identity crisis. If someone they deemed inferior is now thriving, what does that say about their own judgment, or worse, their actual value? One of the most profound elements of this experience is the loss of imagined superiority. Narcissists thrive on the belief that others orbit around them, that their influence is pivotal and their presence irreplaceable. Seeing someone live better, freer, or more successfully without them dismantles that illusion. It confronts them with the reality that their rejection was not a death sentence for the other person. In fact, it may have been the beginning of that person's liberation. And that reality is something the narcissist cannot bear. Often, their initial response is denial. They may downplay the other person's achievements, claiming it's luck, exaggeration, or temporary. They might say things like, "They only got that job because of connections." Or, "Let's see how long that lasts." This minimizes the other person's progress and allows the narcissist to preserve their internal status quo. But if the success continues, especially if it garners public recognition, the narcissist is eventually forced to confront a deeper, more painful truth: they were not essential. Worse, they may have been the obstacle. This realization can lead to narcissistic injury, a term used to describe the intense emotional pain narcissists experience when their grandiose self-image is punctured. In some cases, this triggers narcissistic rage, a disproportionate, often vindictive response aimed at regaining control or reasserting dominance. They may try to discredit the successful person, spread rumors, or attempt to reinsert themselves into that person's life under the guise of reconciliation. But these efforts are rarely about repair. They are about re-establishing the narrative in which they hold power. Other times, the narcissist may experience a collapse. This doesn't always look dramatic. It can manifest as depression, withdrawal, or even somatic symptoms. Because they lack the emotional resilience and self-reflection to process the experience constructively, the weight of watching someone else succeed without them becomes too much to bear. It exposes the hollowness of their sense of self. Without others to mirror their superiority back to them, they feel lost, irrelevant, and vulnerable. Feelings they've spent a lifetime trying to avoid. The irony is that the person who was once rejected has often grown precisely because they were freed from the narcissist's influence. The space created by the absence of manipulation, judgment, or control allowed them to rediscover their own agency, values, and direction. Their success becomes a mirror the narcissist cannot look into without seeing everything they failed to recognize or intentionally suppressed. In these moments, the narcissist may attempt to rewrite history. They might reach out with false humility, feigned support, or vague acknowledgments of past misunderstandings. But again, these moves are strategic, not sincere. They are designed to reclaim a role in the success story they were excluded from. If they can't be the hero, they'll try to be the misunderstood mentor, the complex villain, or at the very least, someone who is still relevant. But genuine success, especially when rooted in authenticity and emotional health, no longer needs that narrative. It speaks for itself, and that silence, where the person no longer seeks validation, revenge, or even acknowledgement from the narcissist, is perhaps the most painful sound of all. Witnessing others' success post-rejection is not just uncomfortable for the narcissist. It's a direct threat to the false identity they've constructed. It forces them to confront the limits of their power, the reality of their own flaws, and the truth that people can, and do, thrive without them. And in a world where their worth depends on always being needed, admired, or feared, that truth is not just difficult to face, it's devastating.